Today we have a really amazing event, although Monday was also amazing, sorry Rob. Another amazing event with two of our friends, Georgina and Marcelo, in conversation with Ferda. So I will do a quick introduction of Georgina and Marcelo and their office, and then Ferda will take over and lead the evening. So super excited to have them both here. Argentine-born Marcelo Spina and Georgina Huljich are renowned architects and distinguished academics. They lead the Los Angeles-based and award-winning architectural practice Patterns, which they founded in 2002. Patterns is also a WBE certified office, which is kind of important. It's Women Business Enterprise. Marcelo is also a design faculty at CIRAC, and Georgina Huljich is also an associate professor at UCLA. But of course, we know them from having them here with us at UPenn, both lecturing and teaching for a few years already. Patterns' work reveals a rigorous and progressive approach to projects and buildings across materials, scales, agendas, and geographies, insisting on the cultural and social relevance of architectural form, contemporary aesthetics, and emerging technologies. The work has been exhibited worldwide, most notably at the Venice Biennale in Italy, the Chicago Biennale, the Art Institute of Chicago, the San Francisco MoMA, the Vienna MAC Museum, and their work is also in the permanent collection there. Their recent projects include the 33,000 square feet A4H, or All for Health, Health for All, office building in Glendale, California, which was the recipient of the AIA LA Next Award. This 5-story building with an idiosyncratic silhouette has as its mission to plan, evaluate, and provide excellent primary health care and social services to medically underserved residents in Glendale. In 2020, in collaboration with the Karma Group, Patterns received the first award in hospitality for the 2020 Rethinking the Futures Award for their project Karma in Bequia. Karma Bequia is a 60,000 square foot resort and is on the second largest island in the Grenadines. The resort features various sizes of living units, public amenities, and a layout that takes advantage of the dramatic sloping site directly to the coast. In the same year, Patterns won the third award in the hospitality category of the 2020 Rethinking the Futures Award for their project Stiff Chili, that is located in Bali and is a single-loaded corridor with approximately 40 suites. It's a very beautiful project, actually. I'm thinking of going once you're done. That basically takes up Balinese motifs while being distinctly contemporary in its aesthetics. Most recently, of course, and that's why we're here tonight, Patterns published Mute Icons with Actar Spain. Part history, part theory, and part monographic atlas, Mute Icons aims to construct a viable alternative to the icon's cliché and exhausted form of communication, positing one that is decidedly introverted and withdrawn. Patterns is here developing a language and a sensibility for discovering simultaneous, contradictory, and even unexpected readings of the architectural form. This evening, Georgina and Marcelo will join Associate Professor of Practice Ferda Kolatan in a conversation about their new book and recent work. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Winka, for the introduction. And I just want to very quickly, before giving it over to the two of you to give you a presentation, say I'd like to welcome you as well. It's always great to have dear friends, but not only friends, but people with whom we share a kind of history over the past 20, 25 years at least, not to out us in terms of age, but so welcome. And just for the audience, the way we thought we would be doing this event is we start with a short presentation by the two of you, or maybe only Georgina, I don't know. And then I have maybe a couple of questions and provocations. We can get into a discussion. And then hopefully we'll have enough time to open it up for a few questions from the audience as well. And with that, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Ferda. Thank you, Winka, for the introduction. It's really such a pleasure to be back and see you all. You really make us feel we are home. It's always, yeah, we love coming here. So, and yeah, thanks everybody for being here tonight. So, mute icons and other dichotomies of the real in architecture, as we have titled the book, was actually a proposal. It was a weekend proposal, like around 6 years ago, when we decided to apply for a Grant Foundation grant, and we were very fortunate to be granted to be awarded the grant, and then that's when we got into the, I would say, the beautiful trouble of having to come up with a strategy to support the argument that we presented in the grant that was basically based on making a book, as Winka was saying, that was part history, part theory, and part atlas, and that it was almost as its core a book that could interrogate images that are historical, contemporary, and more importantly, speculative. So the examination of the book was, or we concentrated on the increasingly dichotomic state of architectural practice, but also discourse and contemporary culture at large. And we analyzed images that existed, but also images that we proposed, and the idea was to develop a language and a sensibility for discovering both simultaneous, but also contradictory, and even, why not, unexpected readings of different images in architecture. So just to go straight forward to the book and the content, or a little bit of a glance on the content and how the book is structured, is basically divided into 5 different sections: concept and history, discipline, and projects and culture. The first section is what we would call concept, which basically argues that due to many external and also internal processes, architecture is in a deep crisis and therefore in need of cultural identity. We all know that in the past 2 decades, everything, the world has been shaped by events like 9/11, the continued environmental effects of climate change, the financial collapse followed by yet another bubbly, maybe, economy, socio-political movements, including Black Lives Matter, Brexit, MAGA, the ongoing refugee crisis, the rise of populism worldwide, etc., etc., etc. I could keep going on and on. So, with no doubt, everything points to a challenge of the most creative and projective aspects of our field. There is an often, I would say, declared idea of the death of the icon, which also includes the specific declaration from the Chinese Prime Minister some years ago of no more weird buildings. And in a way, these are all naive responses to the impulse for increased somewhat social responsibility and the search for common sense and common ground in both in architecture as well as in culture. So, as a contemporary role of the architectural icon came under a rather deep scrutiny, its cultural persistence was almost like begging for a fundamental question, which is what constitutes a relevant and a socially engaged icon nowadays. So not sure that we are able to answer this, but we certainly want to position an alternative. So not that I'm going to give you necessarily a lecture on history at all, but this is really important to contextualize where, the concept of the book and where it came from and where it went to. So if we were to move from culture to the discipline in architecture, or architecture as a discipline, I would say that the question of the image could be traced all the way back to Robert Venturi's dichotomy between the duck and the decorated shed. Also, arguing for the icon, Charles Shanks advocated of the importance to sublimate iconography through abstraction. He suggested that this moves away from literal iconography, let's say from Venturi's duck, as a calculated ambiguity and as an icon with an enigmatic signifier. And according to him, to Charles Shanks, the experience of iconic buildings is as diverse as it is paradoxical, and why not even contradictory. Icons are architecture, quote, in the shape of something uncanny, fascinating, horrible, lovely, quote. He even suggested that in order to be loved and also defended, the iconic needed to be hated and even feared. At first, mentioning the uproar over the construction of the Eiffel Tower in Paris at the turn of the century, which was completely despised at first, only to be revered later. So, in a way, we are certainly not arguing for the continuation of that notion of the icon, which has, already run its course, but we are much more interested in a tradition of abstraction and, I shall say, muteness. So an example is for example, in the Black Square by Kazimir Malevich, which displaces the religious icon that is traditionally placed or positioned in a corner of a room and replaces it with an abstraction. But we're also interested in the real, in an architecture that is also able to produce a constructed tension between legibility and reticence and abstraction and realism and character and context. And maybe within or along similar lines, Rainer Baum insisted that brutalist buildings should produce almost an affecting image that is defined as something which is visually valuable and that affects emotions with pleasure, displeasure, or pointedly almost an admixture of the two. So by, in a way, limiting legibility and visual pleasure, the mute icon demands closer examination, and its resistance conveys resilience, and its introversion stimulates communication. So balance between object and building, the mute icon is defined by a dialectic legibility, say, for example, strange silhouettes or strong postures or constructive brutality and apparent autonomy from the surrounding ground and context. It has an attitude that is absolute and unstable, that it can also be anticipated and strange at the same time, and it can manifest and be withdrawn. So by being elusive and fleeting, then the mute icon, in a way, entices lasting attention by delivering persisting irritation. So it is Timothy Hyde, the theorist Timothy Hyde, who discusses the notion of irritation, and he argues that, quote, the passive manner of irritation or any ugly feeling can only be overcome by a complete transformation of the situation from which that feeling emerges. In the absence of that transformation, irritation persists as a simultaneous pulling together and pushing apart of person and architecture, quote. On the other hand, Victor Slowowski, in his essay Art as Technique, he argues that art exists so that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony, quote. So in other words, to make the stone stony is to actually carve away the inscription that is already imprinted on it, and it is to turn signs back into things, form into abstraction, and building into object. So throughout the book and in our own work, as in patterns, we claim that in order to make the stone be stony, again, architecture must appear strange and wonderful. So here we are with our strange and hopefully wonderful book. So the second section of the book, the first one, concept, the second one is history, which, by the way, I have to say it wouldn't have been possible without, without our collaboration with Constance Bale. And this section intends to construct a lineage of mute iconicity in architecture by focusing on buildings and projects that over a very long and vast period of time have transcended their type, their form, their aesthetics, and in a way have become poster children of architectural irritation, autonomy, and even estrangement. So all the antecedents in the book are organized chronologically, and they are described by means of orthographic representations, and they are rendered familiar, but also at the same time they're rendered strange, and they are, in a way, they appeal to a new life while communicating clearly the paradoxical nature they have as mute icons. So just to give you, just one quick example on one of these historic precedents and what is the dynamics of the book in the approach of each of the precedents. This is the Quasar al-Farid tome, which, we chose it as being completely fascinating in terms of how it resists a very easy definition. So it's basically a solitary figure in the Arabian desert. It has a form that falls between ground and building, and it has a status that falls somewhere between found and authored. It is a composite of many different ontological orders that are merged all together in one single mass, and while the clarity of the image places it in the realm of being iconic, it has a character that is absolutely deceptive and duplicitous and withdrawn. So ultimately, the tome presents a dichotomy between nature and architecture, between the found object, which is a gigantic boulder, and the designed facade, which is an ornamented frontispiece. Another example is the Church of St. George, which is both, it's both unified with, but also autonomous from the ground. It has a very strong relationship with the ground, but it comes from the fact that it's carved out directly out of the rock in which sits and has absolutely no discrete tectonic parts. So when you look at it from a pedestrian level, architecture becomes both ground and object. It's also monument, it's also space, it's nature, it's artifice, and why not is everything and nothing. Boulet's choice of the sphere, in this case, is a deeply political political choice, and suggests the potential of mute icons to subvert existing hierarchies. So I'm gonna move quicker through this, but basically, these are all precedents that ultimately they don't require to attract or to engage, but instead almost like to deter or defend and be irritant. So some of the other precedents that we analyzed, just to name a few, were the Met Breuer at Madison Avenue, or the Pilgrimage Church of St. Mary, the Death Star. So you can see there was a big range of precedents, not just in terms of dates, but also in terms of subject matter. the Bruges Concert Hall, etc., and many more that buy the book and you will find them. So now the next section is a discipline section, which actually acts as a conceptual breach. It classifies and identifies nodes and concepts that move above and beyond history, and it projects possibilities for contemporary architecture to, I would say, take rather seriously. So it literally exploits the visual dialectics of diptychs, and it aims to suggest and construct relations and exchanges. So to do this, we opposed historical precedents with recent projects by our office patterns, and this way we try to generate almost impossible conversations between them, while also, or at the same time, trying to amplify and augment established genres within our field. So, for example, again, the Pilgrimage Church, but in opposition with a project for a museum in Budapest, or the Metropolis of Tomorrow with our Olympia towers, and again, so on and so forth. Finally, the projects section, which is an embedded atlas of our own work within the realm of our professional practice. So basically, we are presenting both built and unbuilt projects, maybe more unbuilt than built ones, but we organize them by means of representational categories. There are a series of diagrams, isometrics, plan obliques, physical models, photorealistic perspectives, photomontages, etc. And they're all featured episodically as a series of appendixes to ultimately rely on the fact of investigating the problematic relationship between abstract representation and the real. So the first appendix is hyperobliques. I guess we would all agree that orthographic projection is one of the most significant attributes of architecture as a discipline that actually portrays architecture as both distorted, as a distorted abstraction and material reality. And hyperobliques intensify this historical medium and are the ultimate paradoxical means of architectural representation. So all these images engage in dissimilar levels of abstraction and realism, and they are completely free from the subjective limitations of perspective, and they incorporate the material precision and the aesthetic sensibility of the real. The last one, no, it's not the last one, there are a few more, sorry. So the appendix about models suggests that models are material reductions of the real, and as such, they're also liberating and powerful. So this is, in a way, the inherent paradox of the architectural object, that it cannot be reduced only to its material constituency, nor it can be completely detached from it either. So all these photos are combinations of physical and digital objects where there is a transferring of material from physical to digital, then back again to material. And in a way, I know, it promotes this feedback loop that, I know, it's not clear exactly where it starts and where it ends. The photorealistic renderings appendix and has actually the capacity to create narratives and to tell stories. So as you can see, each of the sections is actually quite independent in its own narrative in regards to image and image making. And mean, this is why I have to say this is one of my favorite sections. Many of these renderings or these images were inspired by the photography of artists like Gregory Crutzen or Todd Hido and Thomas Ruff. But they're not just about the description of a particular project, but instead they're the result of many different collaborations with visual artists and visualization companies with the intention of conceiving parallel narratives in relationship to the buildings. We were also interested in situating projects within their social, cultural, and political and environmental context. And this is, for example, the case of a museum in Budapest. It's portrayed as in a late winter night, blizzard, the museum is closed. It is strangely contextual, and the museum appears almost as a dark ghost. I mean, it's almost, you don't see the museum at once. I mean, it's really about everything else, and the museum just operates within the background. It's almost that the mass is hidden in plain sight, and it has a silhouette that outlines an obscure and withdrawn character. It sits before a nearly empty boulevard, and it confronts a consolidated block of Art Nouveau, reminiscent and other neoclassical buildings along the Budapest city park. Another museum, this one in Argentina, it is fall, it's twilight, it's cloudy day, the museum is closed. I think we always need the museums to be closed to be able to portray them such a strange way. So as you can see, there is almost a decapitated tree in the corner, a now known piece of clothing that hangs weirdly from a nearby branch, and the bright and exaggerated emergency and exit lights of the museum, they're all on. And they cast, pretty strange effects against the white marble facade of the empty building. So this is imagining architecture after hours, a lonely context, already strange, and all this altering the quietness of this magic moment, almost like forever. In this case, almost like how the image affects talks about environmental effects of climate change. So this is a Glendale project in Los Angeles. It's a winter night, it's foggy, it's rainy, and there is very low visibility and a torrential rain, which is not very real in Los Angeles, but it's almost like Los Angeles looks like a scene from David Fincher's film Seven, where the rain never lets up. And maybe finally the painterly aspects of the cultural geography of Bali. This is one of the projects that Winka mentioned to actually construct a cultural identity. So finally, the appendix on photomontages focus on the paradox between abstraction and realism, and it is in the case of Oblique, which actually aims to experiment with the limits and possibilities of the image and the way it can be technologically captured via drones and its realism, almost like a hyper-enhanced. So I look forward to the discussion. So thank you very much.
Great. Beautiful work, beautiful book. Thanks for the presentation, Georgina. I think I want to start the conversation with a bit of a genealogical, slightly personal history question. Not only because I think maybe it's important for the audience who's not so familiar with the entirety of your development as architects, but also with a rather critical sort of transition period through which I think your work can also be mapped and understood. Reaching back to sort of the late 90s, early 2000s digital project, which was kind of the time where you and a whole number of us, both in the audience as well as myself, sort of started with our practices. And I recall, and of course, even back then, you guys were sort of leaders of your generation in terms of generating ideas that were you know, like trying to come to terms with the new technologies of the digital. And back then, you know, notions of flow, for instance, were, you know, very common, particularly in your work. And I think it's really interesting to, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, to put flow and dynamism and motion and movement, which were all sort of derivatives of animation software that we're all kind of trying to understand back then in regard to what it can do for architecture. And today's presentation, or not today's, I mean, reaching back, I'd say probably, you can correct me, 2008, 2009 is probably an important year toward the monolith. And then toward the icon, the mute icon, right? So from flow to monoliths, I think is not just an important development in your own work, but also something that reflects, at least, you know, in one corner of the architectural avant-garde, how a transition has been taking place culturally. So I was wondering if you can say a couple words. I also wanted to add, for those of you who don't know, there was a really interesting, important exhibition that Marcelo and Georgina curated called Matters of Sensation. I believe it was in 2008 at the Artist Space in New York, which is often, at least among some of us, cited as the moment where one type of project came either to a halt or had to reinvent itself in some way. So I wonder if that's also a critical date for you, but really just what is for you the significance of the move from ideologies of movement, change, flux, and flow toward those of iconicity and monumentality?
Well, maybe I mean, it's a great question, or many. I have to map maybe what to answer first, but I think it's important to know that we were educated at a time, I mean, both at UCLA and Columbia University, where I mean, education was at the digital turn, at a digital turn. And however, I mean, even though we have been in a way placed within that generation, we never really. We've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with the nomenclature of, I know, like digital or I know, paperless architecture. And of course, I mean, we were very happy to be included in, I know, in shows and books and etc. But I think it's I mean, we always wanted our work to be received for what it was. And there's always been a sense of feasibility or plausibility in the work that in a way, I know, maybe critics and writers and curators like see it in a different way. But again, I mean, we were happy to be included in all that. But I think, you know, from the very beginning, like some of these ideas always kind of like moved towards, I know, like a more material realm.
I mean, I think that I mean, it's a great question. The Matters of Sensation show was an important point, as you said. It's interesting sort of to look back, because at the time, you know, there was a whole thing, and maybe a lot was made about like the kind of sensationalism of it, you know, which was not the intention. Our intention at the time was really to kind of put sort of architecture, like lay architecture kind of bare through these objects, let's say, objects, small pieces, models, prototypes, things like that, to not have any kind of process, to remove any sort of notion of the digital, to remove any idea of digital fabrication, digital craft, all of those sort of like themes that had kind of come to be associated with the work. And in our mind, it was never really, in that sense, it wasn't the essence of the work. It was just like, the kind of the gimmicky of it, And we had conversations of this. And so the intention of that show was really to kind of put forward these objects. I don't think we were discussing, that show in that way. But certainly the appeal of it, the beauty of it, in terms of this kind of ecology of objects was really around this idea of almost these sort of autonomous things that entering into a kind of conversation to each other could produce something larger to that. To your earlier questions about the shift from flow to kind of like maybe rocks or monoliths, I think there is a kind of earlier shift that we began to realize probably around that time, around the time of our first book, which was around 2010, that really kind of includes work of kind of these sort of two trajectories. We started to realize that the sort of materialism or ideas that were philosophical in nature that were kind of being brought back to the discipline will not account for things such as like the shapes of lots or the mass of buildings or volumes or things that have been kind of more germane to the history of architecture, and started to kind of see the limits of that. And so therefore, and this is obviously seen in other practices as well, I guess, we began to see the kind of maybe the limits of the flow. And so in our own work, especially when the work begins to get built, I think there is that transition begins to be articulated and exists. So there was never, even though we had projects and we were interested, and I think, the attention to hyperbolic surfaces within volumes was one way of like somehow dealing with that. How do you go from there to kind of monoliths or more sort of like rock? I think there's just an understanding that, and then again, maybe kind of a little digression, is that we never saw our kind of thinking, cultural, intellectual as a sort of subservient to the practice, nor the other way around either, but we always saw somehow those two things kind of in relationship. It means that we didn't want to theorize what we could not realize, and vice versa, so try to adjust those things. And then we wanted to really kind of push forward and realize that architecture can naturally and really kind of behaves in terms of volume, mass, silhouette, outlines, and obviously all those things, and other aspects that maybe are in relation to flow, in relation to the ground, in relation to movement, that could still continue to enhance some of that. And I think some of the work that Georgina was showing in Budapest are sort of hinting to that transition. Some of those are actually still sort of solids conceptually, and yet they're maybe somewhat are sort of hinting to aspects of flow, and it's not,
Yeah, but also in the, if placing flow within the background of the work of the late 90s, and I think there have been just very few projects where, like flow was just determined by a surface. In a way, flow also, was mainly related to the articulation of mass. So in a way, mass and volume that then translated into the rock were always, somewhat embedded within the work from the very beginning. So ultimately, and as Marcelo was saying, after we presented our first monograph in 2011, I would say that then this book, in a way, it's both a fracture from projects that were nice and happy and beautiful to, a series of projects where we are, in a way, we feel that, why do we have to be so nice? Why everything has to be so fluid? Why everything has to be, clearly legible? So, so in a way, I think that that's a, we wanted to be very clear about the point that we are architects, and ultimately, the work that we produce, like there is no way that we can, as Marcelo was saying, like theorize on things that we don't feel that they're also there working within the, I don't know.
That's interesting. I mean, to me, there's a part that seems almost diametrically opposed, obviously, flow monolith, but there are other elements that I do see some kind of continuity in the work. For instance, when it comes to an emphasis on questions of legibility. And you just said fluidity is clear to you, but I could also argue that the notion of fluidity was that you cannot capture it, right? There's a constant sort of shimmering, glittering that does not allow you to hone in on it. And it seems some of that is present in these newer monolithic geometries as well. Just it's manifested in different ways by the way how you angle it, how you cut it. I mean, there are certainly moments that make it difficult to read the shape as is. And it seems that is still something that continues in the work. And that's obviously, I assume, part of the notion of muteness. The other would be affect, and your interest in affect, I think, is still kind of unbroken, which is very clear also when you talk about photographers like, Todd Hido and Crutzen and Struth or whatever. So that to me is interesting as well as a continuity, an art continuity, if you will. Let me jump to the next question. I like my little categories here. I'm, of course, in the context, the political, social context of the last 2 years, and you put up a couple images regarding that, to talk about icons, things that have certain meanings, objects are imbued with meaning, that is some kind of a social, cultural agreement that we, collectively associate with something. And then it's good or bad, or it's first good and then bad, and maybe it's first bad and then good, etc., are obviously questions that have come under the magnifying glass through things like Black Lives Matter and the protests and bringing down monuments and statues, etc. So it's obviously an incredibly charged notion to talk about icons. In fact, I'm actually teaching a studio called Iconoclash right now, so my students are very interested in your take of icons too. So I was wondering if you touched a little bit on it, but I mean, is there more sort of direct way for you to articulate when you use the word, what is a contemporary, you have that question in your book, what is a contemporary icon, right? I think we have somewhat of an idea, but could you give a sort of more specific, maybe not even an answer, but some kind of a description? What makes these projects contemporary icons, in your opinion?
I think
we need to do the whole book to try to figure it out. We are still trying.
No, but I think there is a. I think images have meaning, clearly. If they don't have meaning, they are assigned meaning. In fact, our use of the word icon it's a little bit kind of misplaced, because architects don't make icons, like only culture make icons, after they absorb buildings, they absorb projects in particular ways. And so in that sense becomes interesting how much of an architect can really project iconicity onto things that are like, ultimately just like material, let's say, form. And we're certainly in support of like things that have like been associated with like violence or things like that, that if those things need to be taken down, so be it. I don't think, the question that we're arguing is more like a sort of general, which is like, when images are taken down, they're usually replaced by other images that they have, their own iconography. And the question is, what is that kind of iconography? And obviously, iconography comes from many levels. Our argument is that, that there is still a need for iconography. Like Jenks, you'll say, like, people still want to kind of leave their houses and go to places, and they will do so, partially because these are landmarks, they have like some kind of meaning, they have some level of interest to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. Especially in the public realm. And so we argue for a certain tension that somehow it wouldn't be a complete silence. It wouldn't be the absence of any meaning, the absence of any image. But this idea of attention, this idea of like of pushing together and pulling apart of personal architecture, this idea of an irritant, I think is an interesting case, and it's kind of a paradox that our version of nude icons try to sort of position in a way. How exactly it's done, I think it really kind of, it is project by project. It's not a formula for sure. I mean, it's more of an idea. And this is one of the issues of this book, which is not, it's both kind of a sort of monographic atlas, but it's also kind of an idea book to say, well, here's what we think, architecture can do with some of these issues, instead of architecture becoming a kind of crowd pleaser to issues of, the need for common sense and common ground and all those things, that are definitely important. But architecture doesn't have to just like, architecture can do good without necessarily looking good, without looking just friendly all the time, And in that sense, I think there is an opportunity, obviously more on the sort of public realm than on, developers project, let's say, which is a bit more subversive, to do just that, I mean, it's a complicated subject, obviously, because it involves politics and involves meaning, but we deeply believe that there is a possibility out of that, and it's not necessarily also by architecture just making friends, and being the kind of the sort of do-gooder of the kind of social realm only, let's say. I mean, of course, architecture has to do good, architecture has to engage, buildings have to be open, so if you look at our monoliths, they don't hit the ground with like solidity as the older, monoliths will do. They are mostly kind of open and permeable. So it means like, we're kind of attentive to some of the mistakes of some of the past, and we wouldn't do a lonely castle in the middle of a city, as beautiful as we think that structure is, in the Arabian desert. So, I mean, it's a complex subject.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that it was very surprising, like in the making of the book, like how we would start to learn and experience of these completely, kind of like opposite or impossible discussions between a president and our work. Like in a way, the notion of iconicity was mainly being defined when these two elements were acting in opposition, rather than for the absolute value that each of them have. So in a way, the argument of what constituted the iconic aspect of that conversation was just evolving on a project by project basis, and I don't think we would have been able to do it without having the framework of the book.
Yeah, I mean, this leads me directly into my next question, because I mean, it appears to me you have the word dichotomy in your subtitle of the book, right? Other dichotomies of the real. So it's clear that the dichotomy that we are really talking about is that between the real object of architecture and the representational object of architecture. And that, of course, is, as old as architecture itself, right? I mean, the first carvings or monuments already deal with these issues in their own way. And it will probably always be part of architecture. It's interesting to revisit it once in a while and bring it back to the fore and ask, I guess, new kinds of questions in what those tensions are. I think that's where, the word real or realism, you very, I think, deliberately hint toward, again, a kind of larger cultural movement toward philosophies of realism that in the last 20, 25 years have become, again, sort of more prevalent, speculative realism, but also new materialism, object-oriented ontology, and so forth. A kind of, response to, I would say, the state of the world, the Anthropocene, the kind of global warming, all those kinds of things where, there's a cultural awakening that we should focus at the objects at hand, not at the things that are dependent to our minds, but mind independent, right? I mean, there's that whole narrative going on. And so in that relationship, I'm also interested in the dichotomy, because at the end of the day, the architectural object will always have a representational value of some sort. And it will be different according to whoever looks at it, right? Mm-hmm. The constituency will also define the representational meaning of a particular object. Its time will define it, etc. But when you make that such a central element of your book project, and therefore by definition your projects as well, do you believe that there needs to be some kind of orchestration of that relationship? Do you think there's a way through design to, shed some light on those kinds of frictions in relationship to the contemporary problem of representation and the real object? I'd be interested to maybe hear a couple more lines to that.
I think I agree with everything you said, but the notion that the main dichotomy of the book is between the real and the sort of mechanism of abstraction. I think obviously we use heavily the idea of of obliques, even though there are perspectives, obviously, to sort of depict these things, to depict to depict the pieces kind of in autonomy, the object, the architecture, buildings in autonomy, to center on the space of the objects, rather than the object's own space, which is the kind of big sort of breakdown between, kind of parallel projection and perspective. But as you clearly said, that's obviously a kind of representational issue, let's say. When the objects exist in the world, that's probably going to be a kind of it won't matter. And so what I'm saying, I think the dichotomy is between things that are possibly kind of visually present on the things, let's say, if one conceives of the real as like, that which is kind of available to everyone, no? And so, the idea of like have character and have muteness at the same time, like cancel somehow partially a character of building, or something that it would be sort of, monolithic, but it also would be sort of engaging, something that would, buildings can be monolithic because they cannot be solid, not they can be impenetrable. So monolithicity in architecture is a paradox that is built by architects to maybe delay apprehension and delay understanding of either issue of scales, part to whole, how big is the building, how many levels it has. All of the things that in our mind kind of entice curiosity, attention, and produce a certain, a certain interest, let's say. And so this would be the only thing which, obviously the issue of representation is important because it becomes a way of discussing that, but it's not meant to say that the dichotomy itself is between the kind of real and the version of it, architecture as a kind of representation, if I understand correctly there.
Yeah, to me, abstraction would be a representation.
Right.
When you talk about abstraction as a way of erasing signification on the object, that would be a representational act versus the object also being the withdrawn object, which is the word you use, which would be the real object, right? Yeah. At least if withdrawn is sort of alluding to, Graham's concept.
Exactly.
And its legibility, regardless, if it's directly related to representation or not.
Right.
Yeah.
No, again, to me, it's actually super interesting, that particular tension, and it's clearly not, we cannot give an answer to that. We can sort of try to evoke notions through the way how we design, but I think I find also really quite courageous to take on these kinds of questions. They come certainly with all kinds of perilous conditions. So I think it's really interesting. I want to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. And that question has to do with Los Angeles. And it has to do with context, because in one way your argument has a lot to do with decontextualization, right? The monolith in and of itself is something that stands alone often. It stands in contrast to its immediate environment. Muteness is something that appears to break relationships, right? To a certain degree at least. It doesn't speak, it just is mute. So a lot of what you are presenting to us is sort of emphasizing on decontextualization in order to, I would assume, to find new relations, new legibilities, etc. But then there is LA, and I think LA is very strongly in your projects, in the way how you render them. There is something, I mean, you even mentioned Fincher. I was also thinking about the latest Blade Runner, where it also rains all the time and it's set in LA. So somehow LA is obsessed in science fiction with rain. Maybe not so surprisingly.
Because it's science fiction.
Right.
Yes.
But I'd just be interested, you've been obviously living there for a very long time. Is the monolith, in all of its decontextualized nature, maybe the contextual object for a place like LA in regard to its own urbanism or the lack thereof?
I mean, I think your question of LA is really timely. And I think everyone, well, at least we have a kind of a sort of, like with everything else, I guess, a sort of love-hate relationship with things. And Los Angeles is not, maybe it's not exception. I mean, obviously we have been there and it's a great city for a number of things. But there is this kind of inherent tension, you know, even in the way you perceive the city and histories of the city, this idea that, you know, people like to complain about one thing, but also complain about the opposite as well, you know, you know, the city is too homogeneous, but it's also too eclectic and so on. And I think these kind of ideas, those tensions, register in us, you know, as a kind of, maybe as our work in a bit of a reactionary way to, you know, the perceived culture of the new or the excess of the new in Los Angeles, which is so kind of, you know, pervasive. The culture of the radical, of, you know, the sort of previous generations and so on. And so I think we try to kind of, you know, if anything, we try to, through our work, build some kind of cultural identity. And it's interesting because the question of context that you mentioned, many of the latest work we have in Los Angeles are actually what one would consider, you know, as a kind of like basic adaptive reuse, let's say. You know, there are existing bowstring truss turned into medical offices, or an existing kind of bastard mid-century turned into a kind of nicer, you know, contemporary house, or, you know, or a kind of shady corner building turned into a kind of a nice public urban theater on the Sunset Strip. So in all of those things, there's a point that we try to make to sort of turn things around, you know, without like completely destroying what exists, but trying to somehow give sort of newfound meaning to these often banal structures, let's say. And in that, you know, let's say, obviously, you know, bringing new things, new attribute properties and features, but still kind of maintaining that tension with what it was. I think it's something valuable. I mean, I don't know. It's a super interesting question because we haven't really thought about it.
We never thought about it. And I think I mean, I wouldn't say that this is an LA book, because, I mean, we're Argentinians, and you know, as much as our practice has been, you know, mainly based in Los Angeles, we really, I mean, we don't consider ourselves to, you know, kind of operate locally, but, you know, all the opposite. But I think there is a fact of like wanting to constantly, as Marcelo was saying, revisit what we've seen before, because that's an intrinsic quality of Los Angeles. So in a way, if we were elsewhere, maybe that critical attitude wouldn't be as present as it is while living in Los Angeles. So maybe, I know, the attitude towards, or maybe the thinking of the narrative of how to look at the work, let's say within the framework of this book or a similar one, might have been different. So we cannot avoid that our practice is based there, in LA. And so, I mean, in a way, it is consistent to being there, but it's also a reaction to the way that things operate in Los Angeles. Because iconicity is also expressive. There is, I mean, it's either flat and homogeneous, or it is, you have the Walt Disney Concert Hall. So,
yeah, exactly. Great. Yeah, maybe are there, I'm sure there are, excellent. Do we have a mic? Like, right front, second row over here, please.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. So rich and so lot that we need to be sure. It seems that in architecture historically, in a vast majority of cases, the notion of iconicity has presupposed the notion of duality, right? So that is a more or less explicit disengagement between the domain of, should we say, the building as representation, so everything to do with the figural condition, shape, mass, and how all of those qualities amount to imageability, right? Quality of imageability of the building on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the domain of the building as spatial organization, right? So everything that happens on the inside, spatial articulation, right? So I was wondering whether you guys have given any thought to this, should we say, dichotomy, another dichotomy to add to the one that you were talking about earlier, about how to perhaps transcend it, or how to establish some kind of relationship between these two domains, whether you want a continuity, or one of tension, or one of rejection, or further that disengagement. Have you guys given any thought to that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Just to be clear, I think that the question is the relationship between iconicity, let's say the image, exterior appearance of architecture, and maybe spatial organization, internal organization. I mean, a question was asked, and at this point, you become aware of like the shortcomings of your work, and the shortcomings of the book that is all about images, let's say, and purposely and consciously so. There's not a single interior, not a single plan on it, only diagrams, and so it's focused on that. It's aimed to be exhaustive of a certain problem, but not to say that architecture shouldn't care about interior, shouldn't care about drawings, and so on. In fact, we do a lot of that, in our own work. I think how those two things come together, it is paradoxical and problematic in a way, and so we sort of took the book as a bit of a test to say how can we sort of do this so far, not only just on the renditions that we did, over years, but also in the descriptions, and we realized that often some of our own description of the project needed more information that we were really putting forward, and it was impossible not to kind of, consider. I mean, like, we know the projects, we know their plans, we understand sections and so on. So, I think it's somewhat together with, but the book intends to be a little bit myopic in that sense, to really concentrate on something and see how much you can sort of tease out from there. But like the lobotomy, I mean, clearly if you were out there as an architect just to kind of do shape and character and all of those things, there would be much easier and much less laborious ways of doing it than the way we are doing it. So I think, if you kind of read a little bit the work and the way we write about it, it's certainly not aiming to a kind of, happy kind of quickly sort of make up. It's not a decorated shed approach, to architecture. So it's not a kind of sort of new neo-pomo idea of how to create those images. So in fact, we're sort of looking deeply to those images, very much as kind of in relationship with what one would consider form, no? Like, I mean, form, mass, volume, in a way. I mean, those things are not the same, but they're clearly in relationship with each other, and therefore are completely related to, you know, internal organization of projects and so on. I don't know if I answered your question, you know, but...
I mean, not to say that any of that should have been included in the book. I was wondering almost more, you know, on a conceptual level, right? I mean, you guys have shown the Venturian model. I mean, that lobotomy is embedded there already, right? I mean, we get information about the building as a site, but not about the interior. And usually, oftentimes, when you bring up this question, you're going to get a certain rejection, perhaps of iconicity, but not so much the idea that actually you can perhaps imagine new interiors or new models of special organization precisely through iconicity, right? As opposed to say, no, iconicity is wrong, let's go and let's worry about this or worry about that. So I was wondering about just what. But
it's actually a really important point that you are bringing up with the interiors, because, I mean, that would be maybe another volume of the book, in the sense that, I mean, like right now we prefer thinking that all the precedents that we are presenting in the book, they're solid masses, right? I mean, from the moment that we start to consider them like being hollowed and being just the containers of interior, I think not that the conversation would be different, but it will have to address many points that we are not necessarily focusing on right now.
Okay. Other questions? Rob, first row, right here.
Really simple question. Fantastic work, of course, and fantastic book. Very simple question. Can you talk a little bit about the role of articulation or pattern, as patterns, in its role in either kind of defining or like how does it speak towards the icon or the monolith?
I don't know, maybe a kind of practical, very straightforward answer would be that, or maybe one of the readings is that it has to do with legibility and the idea of, like the object almost like promoting different narratives depending on the range of vision and like the description that it presents depending on what you see, if you're seeing the silhouette, or if you, like that's from a, kind of like from a far range, but then you get very close, and then the idea of that articulation might start to bring up like a complete different set of relationships between, let's say, surface and mass, or volume. Yeah, I mean, that's...
You were asking of the kind of more at the level of like surfaces.
Yeah,
right?
surface articulation.
Right.
I mean, texture, yeah, exactly,
yeah,
relief. Yeah. Part of the reason I mention is you were also, Marcelo commented before about how a monolith kind of hides kind of architectural things like, floor levels, these types of things. And it seems that a lot of the kind of textural or graphical work in a lot of your projects is very much in unison with the object and seems to enable it to speak in a way that it's no longer a victim of mullions or these kind of architectural scale things that might undermine the integrity of the object itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is always an ongoing thing, and this is maybe one of the things that are like, it becomes a bit like subjective, because we realize that sometimes, we have certain kind of reactions to, articulate certain things, but it's never the kind of full thing, it's never, or it usually is a matter of even like giving volume differences, let's say, to given like corner conditions. The project in Glendale has sort of literally it's sort of a kind of corner problem as a three-dimensional corner, and we keep sort of drawing the Choisy views, not because we like Choisy, which we do, but also because we actually are showing a facade which is entirely flat, and it's just curtain wall, with like butt joints and so on, and which is supposed to almost disappear into kind of sky reflections. The other one, it's a series of vertical things which are kind of nosy, fussy, let's say, and will have depth. And then the bottom one is a kind of, it's a sort of stamped metal soffit, and And, you know, we have details of how we want that thing, because obviously to try and make all that, you know, kind of disappear into a sort of knife edge, it's not an easy thing, and we don't know if we were able to do it. And, you know, and so it's like, technically the volume was just a prism that was cut, you know, in a corner. So nothing indicated in the volume that it needed to be three-phase, let's say. And so, I don't know, maybe this is like, it's a good question, you know. I think we think of it in terms of like architecture means like, and a sculpture probably wouldn't think of it that way, because you will see the object probably at close range, you know, you wouldn't see it 2 blocks away. Architecture has that sort of far away and close up, which for me should add something, you know, to the, you know, to the material, to the articulation, and we try, if possible, to deal with those things, you know, with different materials or different techniques.
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately
more or less
challenges the legibility of the object, because then, I mean, and I think that's when maybe we talk about that it doesn't have to be necessarily geometrically complex, because there is already also the intention of using the way that the mass is articulated in order to also confuse that geometry. And maybe, I don't know, a cube, you might never see or perceive the cubeness of the cube, just because of the altering and the way that these surfaces are articulated.
Great. Maybe one more, if there is, and then we can. Any other questions? Jonas.
Hey, congratulations! Awesome presentation and book. I think you achieved the very challenging thing to add something to your project with the book itself. I think I get the sense this could be an icon in and of itself, not a mute one, but a very thoughtful one, very bold and daring, and at the same time, well prepared and thoughtful. There's a particular part of this chapter, the second chapter, I think, that Georgina was presenting, where you are, and this goes back to Ferda's question of representation maybe, where you're showing these wonderful projects, but you are illustrating them not with the same visuals that we know. And I was wondering if you did create these representations yourself, or were these renderings that you made upon a remodeled version of the project? I think the boldness lies in adopting those projects in order to position your own. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. I mean, I'll be super honest with this. You know, when we you know, Georgina mentioned, you know, we had this like weekend idea for a book. Hey, Graham is due Monday, we send it out, whatever, we put it out there. And then we like somehow like wanted to try and make it work. Let's say, how do you do a book that is a monograph but it's not a monograph, and it connects to the things that we've been discussing and so on. So then you start researching, we're going to use all this project and so on, but then it's like, we don't want to have, we're architects, we're not historians, you know, we're like, I mean, with all due respect, means like, I never had to kind of request images, you know, and sources, or, you know, or ask MoMA for like, give me all these images. And so we figure like, we're just going to make these things, you know, we're just going to model them and render them. And then, I mean, you know, certain projects are easy, but how do you render projects such as like, you know, Leduc's, you know, where like only drawings exist, you know, like, I mean, you render them as drawing version of the rendering, which we try. You render them as what the intended architect wanted to do. We know Leduc's, you know, Boulez, had this like amazing illustration where it will show the building in mostly shadow, and then show like super close up of those stones, you know. And so from far away it looks like a solid rock. Close up, you could see there were panels. And, you know, same happens with Nouvel's unbuilt opera house in Tokyo, where like you had this kind of thing. So we try to somehow stay a little bit true to that idea in a way, but obviously at that point is where like, you know, and we haven't had any architect that's complained. I mean, clearly we're not expecting Boulez send an email to us, but like, you know, it's like okay, we're going to rewrite history in some form, you know, take some licenses where probably some people will not be happy with it, you know, because these things are out of the context. They are only, let's say, their realism it includes only, it's a very selective realism, let's say, you know. I mean, like, I don't know, Casa de Música has probably a few other things that are not rendered there, and we decided to show.
So that's when we might get the email from Ahmed.
I'm sure I have other things, you know, but.
Yeah, but I think it's also, I mean, it also has to do with maybe in terms of how you make a book, and what I was saying before in terms of, I mean, the constant surprises and the evolution of ideas that maybe studied in a way, but then just the actual, I know, like technicalities of how we were arriving to certain things. I mean, in this case, made us almost have the absolute need to author all these precedents. I mean, in a way that we need to own them in order to be able to have these conversations with other projects. I mean, we couldn't, it wasn't just about, even though that's maybe one of the ideas from the beginning, that we just needed the source material, we needed the data, and then, well, let's see what we do with that. We need to really own everything in order to establish those narratives. So 5 years of modeling and drawing and trying, and yeah.
Okay, it's almost 8. I'd really like to thank the two of you for this really thought-provoking book and the presentation and coming out here.
Thank you, Ferda.
I thank the audience, of course. The books are in the back. I really recommend all of you to at least have a look at them at your time. And then there is a reception, I believe, in the tents. Is that the case?
Wow.
Wonderful.
Oh.
So you can then also wander over there. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.